The smoke had barely cleared over Berlin when the race began. It was June 1945, and the Third Reich lay in ruins, its cities pulverized, its armies shattered, its leadership dead or captured. But beneath the rubble and ash, something else remained, something neither Roosevelt nor Churchill nor Stalin was willing to leave behind. The weapons were still there. The laboratories, the blueprints, the scientists, and the Americans wanted them first. Operation Paperclip did not announce itself with fanfare or public declaration. There were no press conferences, no congressional hearings, no debates about morality or law. It began quietly in the offices of Army intelligence and the corridors of the Pentagon, where men in crisp uniforms studied maps of occupied Germany and circled names on lists typed in small, precise letters. These were not the names of war criminals destined for trial. They were the names of engineers, chemists, physicists, rocket designers, men whose expertise had built the Luftwaffe's jets, the Kriegsmarine submarines, and the ballistic missiles that had rained down on London. Men whose knowledge was now worth more than gold. The American teams arrived in Germany with orders that were simple and urgent. Find the weapons, secure the scientists, and do it before the Soviets did. The Red Army was advancing from the east, swallowing territory with a hunger sharpened by 4 years of devastation and 20 million dead. Stalin's intelligence services were hunting the same prizes, dispatching their own agents into the wreckage of the Reich with instructions that mirrored Washington's in every essential detail. This was not merely occupation. It was extraction. And time was not a luxury either side possessed. The V-2 rocket sites were the first targets. These weapons had terrorized Britain in the final year of the war, screaming out of the stratosphere at speeds no pilot could intercept and no gunner could shoot down. More than 3,000 had been launched, most of them from mobile platforms in occupied Holland and northern Germany, and they had killed over 9,000 civilians in London, Antwerp, and other cities. But the rockets themselves were only part of the prize. What mattered more were the engineers who had designed them, the factories where they had been assembled, and the documents that explained how they worked. The Americans knew where to look. In the spring of 1945, as the Wehrmacht collapsed and the Nazi state disintegrated, German scientists and officers had begun fleeing westward, away from the advancing Soviets and toward the Anglo-American lines. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and ambitious rocket engineer who had overseen the V-2 program from its inception. Von Braun had surrendered to American forces in May, along with hundreds of his colleagues and thousands of pages of technical records. He had done so deliberately, calculating that the Americans would be more interested in his expertise than in his past. He was correct. By early June, American intelligence officers were fanning out across the American and British occupation zones, following leads, interrogating prisoners, and raiding installations that had been abandoned in the chaos of Germany's collapse. They found rocket components hidden in barns, buried in forests, stashed in alpine caves. They found blueprints rolled up in metal tubes and stuffed into walls. They found prototype engines, guidance systems, fuel pumps, pieces of a program that had cost billions of Reichsmarks and consumed the lives of tens of thousands of forced laborers, many of whom had died in the underground factories where the missiles were built. At Nordhausen, in the Harz Mountains, the Americans discovered the Mittelwerk, a vast subterranean complex carved into the rock, where V-2 rockets had been assembled by slave labor drawn from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. The conditions inside had been nightmarish. Prisoners worked 16-hour shifts in freezing tunnels lit by dim electric bulbs, breathing air thick with stone dust and chemical fumes. They were beaten, starved, worked to death. More than 20,000 had perished there. When American troops entered the Mittelwerk in April, they found the production lines still intact, the tools still in place, the rockets still standing in rows like monuments to cruelty and ambition. By June, those rockets were being loaded onto trucks and trains, bound for ports on the North Sea and then for the United States. The airlift of German technology was conducted with methodical efficiency. American engineers dismantled entire laboratories, crated up machinery, and cataloged everything from high-altitude test chambers to wind tunnels designed for supersonic research. They seized tons of documents, technical manuals, test reports, design schematics, and shipped them across the Atlantic to Wright Field in Ohio and other military research centers. The scale of the operation was staggering. In the first months alone, more than 300 rail cars filled with rocket parts and equipment rolled westward out of Germany. The V2 program, which Hitler had hoped would turn the tide of the war, was being transplanted wholesale into the American arsenal. But the rockets were only one piece of the puzzle. The Americans were also hunting jet aircraft, and here too the Germans had achieved breakthroughs that no other nation could match. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had entered service in 1944 and had proven devastatingly effective in combat. It was faster than any Allied piston engine plane, capable of outrunning American bombers and shredding them with cannon fire before their escorts could react. The Germans had also developed the Arado AR-234, a jet-powered bomber, and had been testing rocket-powered interceptors like the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, which could climb to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes. American pilots had encountered these machines in the skies over Germany and had reported back with a mixture of awe and alarm. The jets were a glimpse of the future, and the future belonged to whoever could master their technology. By June, American teams were combing through Luftwaffe airfields, pulling intact Me-262s out of hangars, interviewing captured pilots, and tracking down the engineers who had designed the Jumo 004 turbojet engines that powered them. Some of these aircraft were flown to airfields in France and then shipped to the United States for study. Others were dismantled on the spot, their engines and instruments packed into crates alongside the technical documents that explained their construction. The chemical weapons were another matter entirely. Germany had developed nerve agents during the war, sarin, tabun, soman, substances of such lethality that a single drop on the skin could kill within minutes. These agents had never been used in combat, not because of any moral restraint on Hitler's part, but because Germany's military leadership feared Allied retaliation in kind. But the stockpiles remained, stored in bunkers and depots scattered across the country, and the formulas and production methods were locked in the minds of the chemists who had created them. The Americans found these stockpiles in June, hidden in forests and buried in underground magazines. The quantities were enormous, tens of thousands of shells, bombs, and artillery rounds filled with nerve gas, along with barrels of the agents themselves. The discovery was deeply unsettling. These were weapons that could kill on a scale that eclipsed even the atomic bomb, at least in certain scenarios. A single airplane could disperse enough sarin to render an entire city uninhabitable. The idea that such weapons might fall into Soviet hands was intolerable. The American response was swift and secretive. The chemical weapons were inventoried, the most dangerous samples were secured, and the scientists who had developed them were identified and interrogated. Some of these men were eventually brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, despite the fact that their work had violated international agreements and despite the fact that some had tested their creations on concentration camp prisoners. The calculus was cold and simple. Their knowledge was too valuable to leave behind, and the Soviets could not be allowed to acquire it. Meanwhile, the race against the Red Army intensified. The borders of the occupation zones had been agreed upon at Yalta and Potsdam, but the demarcation lines meant little in the chaotic summer of 1945. Soviet forces were pushing westward into Thuringia and Saxony, regions rich in industrial infrastructure and scientific talent. American commanders knew that once the Soviets consolidated control over their zone, anything left behind would be lost. So the extraction operations accelerated. Intelligence officers worked around the clock, identifying targets, securing transportation, and moving assets westward before the handover of territory took place. There was no pretense of legality in much of this. The Potsdam Agreement called for the demilitarization of Germany and the elimination of its war-making capacity. The spirit of that agreement demanded the destruction of weapons and the punishment of those who had built them. But Operation Paperclip was premised on the opposite logic. The weapons were too advanced to destroy, and the scientists were too valuable to prosecute. So the Americans took what they wanted and justified it as necessity. The war in Europe was over, but the war that was coming, the Cold War, had already begun, and in that war, German technology was a weapon too powerful to leave on the table. By the end of June, hundreds of German scientists and engineers were in American custody, many of them undergoing debriefings at secure facilities in Bavaria and the Rhineland. Their Nazi party memberships were being scrubbed from their records, their connections to war crimes downplayed or erased. Werner von Braun, whose rockets had been built by slave labor, was already being groomed for a new life in America. So were dozens of others, men who had worn SS uniforms, men who had designed weapons of mass murder, men whose expertise now outweighed their guilt. The moral complexities of Operation Paperclip were not lost on everyone involved. Some American officers protested, arguing that bringing Nazi scientists to the United States made a mockery of the principles for which the war had been fought. Others pointed out that many of these men were complicit in atrocities and should face trial at Nuremberg alongside the generals and bureaucrats. But these objections were overruled. The decision had been made at the highest levels of government, and it was not open to debate. The scientists would come to America. Their sins would be forgiven, and their knowledge would be put to use in the service of a new enemy. The Soviets, for their part, were conducting their own version of Operation Paperclip. As American teams worked in the West, Soviet officers were doing the same in the East, rounding up scientists, dismantling factories, and shipping entire research programs back to the USSR. The Germans caught in the middle had little choice in the matter. They went where they were taken, whether to America or to the Soviet Union, and they worked for whoever held their lives in hand. The weapons themselves told a story of ambition and desperation. The V-2 rockets, sleek and menacing even in their dismantled state, represented years of research that had consumed resources Germany could not spare. Each missile had cost as much as a bomber to produce, yet could carry only a single warhead and could not be reused. They were terror weapons designed to break morale rather than win battles, and they had failed in that purpose. But their technology was sound, their engineering brilliant, and their potential for the future undeniable. The jet aircraft were equally revolutionary. The Me-262 had introduced an entirely new paradigm of aerial combat, one in which speed and altitude trumped maneuverability and firepower. Allied pilots who had faced these machines in combat spoke of them with grudging respect, describing how they would streak past bomber formations too fast to intercept, fire a burst, and vanish before the escorts could react. Had Germany deployed them earlier and in greater numbers, the air war over Europe might have taken a very different course. Now those same aircraft sat in American hangars, their secrets laid bare. And the chemical weapons remained the darkest prize of all, silent, invisible, capable of killing with efficiency that made conventional explosives seem almost humane by comparison. The scientists who had created them spoke in technical language about molecular structures and dispersion rates, but what they had made was poison in its purest form, and the Americans knew it. By the winter of 1946, they were gone. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had disappeared from the rubble of the Reich, extracted quietly and methodically by American intelligence services and military authorities. They had been pulled from POW camps, from ruined cities, from hiding places in the countryside. Some had surrendered willingly, seeing in American custody a refuge from Soviet vengeance or Allied prosecution. Others had been persuaded, their families used as leverage, their past crimes overlooked in exchange for cooperation. A few had been taken against their will, deemed too valuable to leave behind regardless of their preferences. And now they were vanishing across the Atlantic, bound for a country that had spent 4 years fighting the regime they had served. The official paperwork described them as specialists, technical advisors, consultants. The files that traveled with them had been sanitized, their Nazi party affiliations minimized or erased entirely, their involvement in forced labor programs and weapons development recast as purely scientific endeavor. Men who had designed rockets assembled by slave labor were now described as pioneers of aerospace engineering. Chemists who had tested nerve agents on concentration camp prisoners were reclassified as experts in industrial chemistry. Physicians who had conducted experiments on human subjects in the name of aviation medicine became researchers in the field of high-altitude physiology. The transformation was bureaucratic, efficient, and utterly deliberate. The weapons went with them. 300 tons of German military technology, rockets, jet engines, guidance systems, optical instruments, chemical samples, technical documents, had been crated, cataloged, and shipped to the United States throughout 1945 and into early 1946. The V-2 components alone filled dozens of cargo ships. Entire Me-262 jet fighters were dismantled and loaded into transport aircraft. Prototypes of weapons that had never seen combat were secured in warehouses and laboratories across occupied Germany, then quietly moved westward before Soviet forces could claim them. By the time the world's attention had shifted from the ruins of Berlin to the trials at Nuremberg, the extraction was nearly complete. The American public knew nothing of this. Operation Paperclip remained classified, its existence hidden behind layers of military secrecy and bureaucratic obfuscation. The men who arrived at ports in New York and Boston came without fanfare, processed through immigration under false pretenses, their backgrounds scrubbed clean by intelligence officers who understood that the American people were not yet ready to welcome Nazi scientists into their midst. The same citizens who had bought war bonds and sent their sons to fight in Europe would not easily accept the idea that their government was now employing the very men who had built Hitler's war machine. So the truth was kept from them, buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades. In Germany, the impact of these extractions was immediate and visible. The country was in ruins, its cities bombed into skeletal remnants, its infrastructure shattered, its population starving and homeless. The winter of 1945 was one of the coldest on record, and millions of Germans faced it without adequate food, fuel, or shelter. The Allied occupation authorities were struggling to maintain order, to feed the population, to prevent the spread of disease and the collapse of what little remained of civil society. And in the midst of this catastrophe, the Americans were systematically stripping Germany of its intellectual capital and industrial assets. The factories that had produced the V-2 rockets were dismantled, their machinery shipped to the United States or destroyed to prevent Soviet acquisition. The laboratories where jet engines had been perfected were emptied, their equipment crated and loaded onto trains. The research institutes where aerodynamics and rocketry had advanced beyond anything the Allies had achieved were closed, their staffs scattered or recruited. What could not be taken was often demolished, rendered useless to ensure that neither the Soviets nor a resurgent Germany could ever use it again. The policy was clear: Germany would be stripped of its capacity to wage war, and the victors would claim the spoils. But the spoils were not evenly divided. The zones of occupation had been agreed upon by the Allied powers, but the Americans and British moved faster and more aggressively than the Soviets in securing German scientific talent. By the time Soviet intelligence services realized the scale of what was being taken, much of the most valuable material was already gone. The Soviets responded in kind, conducting their own forced recruitment of German scientists in the Eastern Zone, but they were working from a smaller pool and with less advanced preparation. The Americans had been planning Operation Paperclip since 1944, identifying targets and establishing priorities long before Germany's surrender. The Soviets were catching up, but they were behind. The German scientists themselves occupied an uncomfortable position. They were prisoners, effectively, though few were treated as such. They had been defeated, their nation destroyed, their leader dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. Many had believed in the Nazi cause, or had at least benefited from it, accepting positions and funding that came with the expectation of loyalty to the regime. Now that regime was gone, and they were assets to be bartered and traded between the powers that had destroyed it. Some adapted quickly, eager to continue their work under new management. Others struggled with the moral weight of what they had done, though such struggles rarely prevented them from accepting American offers of employment and relocation. Wernher von Braun was among the first to arrive in the United States, brought to Fort Bliss in Texas in the fall of 1945 along with more than 100 of his rocket team. They were housed on the military base, given workshops and laboratories, and set to work reconstructing the V-2 program for American purposes. Von Braun adapted seamlessly, presenting himself as a scientist who had been forced to serve the Nazi regime but whose true loyalty had always been to the dream of space exploration. It was a narrative that glossed over his membership in the SS, his use of slave labor, and his knowledge of the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora. The American authorities accepted this narrative because it was useful, because prosecuting von Braun would mean losing his expertise, and because the Cold War was already beginning to overshadow the moral reckonings of the war just ended. Others followed throughout 1946. Aeronautical engineers arrived at Wright Field in Ohio. Chemists were sent to military research facilities in Maryland and New Jersey. Medical researchers, some of them deeply complicit in human experimentation, were brought to military hospitals and universities. The vetting process was cursory at best, designed to identify useful expertise rather than moral culpability. Men whose wartime activities should have disqualified them from entry into the United States were admitted anyway, their files doctored, their histories rewritten. The justification was always the same. The Soviets could not be allowed to acquire this knowledge. The alliance that had defeated Germany was already fracturing, divided by ideology and mutual suspicion. The Americans believed, not without reason, that Stalin intended to dominate Europe and spread communism across the continent. The Soviets believed, also not without reason, that the Americans and British were preparing to turn on them, to use their monopoly on atomic weapons to dictate terms to the world. In this context, German scientists were not war criminals to be punished but weapons to be claimed, and the nation that claimed them would gain an advantage in the conflict that everyone could see coming. The 300 tons of weaponry told the same story. Crate after crate of V-2 components arrived at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where American engineers began assembling and testing them. The first American-launched V-2 lifted off in April 1946, carrying instruments into the upper atmosphere and providing data that would prove invaluable for the development of ballistic missiles. The Me-262 jet fighters were studied at airfields across the country, their engines reverse-engineered, their aerodynamics analyzed. The knowledge gained from these machines would inform the design of the first generation of American jet aircraft, planes that would dominate the skies over Korea just a few years later. The chemical weapons were handled with extreme caution. The nerve agents seized from German stockpiles were among the most lethal substances ever created, and the Americans had no equivalent in their own arsenal. The scientists who had developed sarin and tabun were debriefed extensively, their formulas and production methods recorded and classified. Some of these men were brought to the United States to continue their research, now under American auspices. The work they had done for Hitler was reframed as a contribution to American national security, and the moral questions raised by their employment were quietly suppressed. Back in Germany, the world watched the country burn, though burn was perhaps the wrong word for what was happening. The fires had gone out by 1946, but the destruction remained. Berlin was a landscape of broken buildings and empty streets, its population reduced by death and displacement, its future uncertain. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Munich, every major city bore the scars of Allied bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and reduced urban centers to rubble. The rural areas were flooded with refugees, millions of ethnic Germans expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries, traveling westward with whatever they could carry and dying by the thousands from cold, hunger, and disease. The Nuremberg trials were underway, and the world's attention was focused on the courtroom where Nazi leaders faced justice for crimes that defied comprehension. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl. The architects of the Third Reich's aggression and genocide sat in the dock, their guilt documented in meticulous detail, their defenses hollow and unconvincing. The trials were broadcast, reported, analyzed. They represented a reckoning, a moment when the civilized world stood in judgment of those who had sought to destroy it. But even as the trials proceeded, even as the verdicts were handed down and the sentences carried out, the Americans were employing hundreds of men who had served the same regime, who had built the weapons and conducted the research that had made Germany's war machine possible. The contradiction was stark, but it was not publicly acknowledged. The officials who authorized Operation Paperclip did not see themselves as hypocrites. They saw themselves as realists, as men who understood that the world had changed, that the enemy now was not Germany but the Soviet Union, and that winning the next war required using every tool available, even if those tools came with blood on them. The moral calculus was simple. The scientists' knowledge was more valuable than their punishment, and letting the Soviets acquire that knowledge was a risk the United States could not afford to take. By mid-1946, the program had taken on a life of its own. The initial goal had been to secure German rocket technology and prevent its acquisition by the Soviets, but the scope expanded rapidly. Engineers who specialized in submarine design were brought to American naval yards. Experts in infrared optics were sent to research laboratories. Physicians who had studied the effects of extreme cold and high altitude on the human body, often through experiments on unwilling subjects, were given positions at military medical facilities. The criteria for inclusion in the program grew looser over time, the scrutiny of candidates' backgrounds less rigorous. What mattered was expertise, not ethics. The German scientists who arrived in America found themselves in a strange limbo. They were not prisoners, but they were not free. They were valuable, but they were also despised by many who learned of their presence. They lived on military bases, worked under close supervision, and understood that their continued employment depended on their usefulness. Some thrived in this environment, grateful for the opportunity to continue their work and eager to prove their worth to their new employers. Others struggled with isolation, with guilt, with the knowledge that they were complicit in crimes they could not undo and could not escape. The weaponry, meanwhile, was being transformed. The V-2 rockets that had terrorized London were now tools of scientific research, carrying instruments into the upper atmosphere and providing data on cosmic rays, atmospheric composition, and the behavior of materials at extreme altitudes. The jet engines that had powered the Luftwaffe's fighters were being studied and improved, their designs incorporated into American aircraft that would soon set speed and altitude records. The nerve agents that had sat and used in German bunkers were being tested and stockpiled, becoming part of America's chemical weapons arsenal. What had been German was now American, the technology and the men who created it rebranded as assets in a new conflict. The transformation was complete by the end of 1946, at least in its initial phase. The scientists had new identities, new employers, new lives. The weapons had new purposes, new designations, new classifications in military inventories. The past had been rewritten, not erased but edited, sanitized for a narrative that required these men to be more useful than guilty, more valuable than culpable. The files that documented their work for the Third Reich were locked away in classified archives, inaccessible to prosecutors, to journalists, to historians who might ask uncomfortable questions. Germany, meanwhile, continued to suffer. The occupying powers had divided the country into zones, each administered according to the priorities and ideologies of its occupier. In the American, British, and French zones, efforts were underway to rebuild infrastructure, to establish democratic institutions, to denazify the population through re-education and lust ration. But these efforts were hampered by the sheer scale of destruction, by shortages of food and fuel, by the logistical nightmare of managing millions of displaced persons. In the Soviet zone, the process was harsher, more punitive. Factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Land was confiscated and redistributed. Former Nazis were tried in people's courts, their sentences often brutal and summary. The ordinary Germans who remained understood that they had lost more than the war. They had lost their country's sovereignty, its industry, its future. The scientists and engineers who might have led Germany's post-war recovery were gone, taken by the occupiers who now dictated terms. The weapons that might have been leveraged in negotiations had been seized and removed. What remained was a shell, a defeated nation stripped of the tools it would need to rebuild itself as anything other than a subordinate state in a world now dominated by two superpowers. The irony was not lost on some observers, though few spoke it aloud. The United States had fought a war against Nazi Germany in the name of freedom, democracy, and justice. It had condemned the regime's brutality, its contempt for human life, its willingness to sacrifice millions in pursuit of conquest and racial ideology. And now, barely a year after victory, it was employing the men who had made that regime's ambitions possible, sheltering them from prosecution, and using their knowledge to build weapons that might one day be used in another war. The justification was security, necessity, the logic of great power competition. But the contradiction remained stark and undeniable. The scientists themselves rarely spoke of this contradiction. They were survivors, pragmatists, men who had learned to serve whoever held power. They had served Hitler because Hitler had funded their research and valued their expertise. Now they served the Americans for the same reasons. Some felt guilt, though guilt was a luxury few could afford in the wreckage of post-war Germany. Others felt relief, grateful to have escaped prosecution and to have found employment in a country that still had resources and ambition. A few felt nothing at all, viewing their work as apolitical, as science divorced from the uses to which it was put. But the uses were never divorced from politics. The rockets, the jets, the chemical agents, all of it was military technology designed to kill, to dominate, to project power. The scientists who created these weapons could tell themselves they were advancing human knowledge, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, but the truth was simpler and darker. They were building tools of war for one empire because they had lost the war while building tools for another. The change of employer did not change the nature of the work. By the time 1946 ended, Operation Paperclip had achieved its primary objectives. The scientists were secured, the weapons were in American hands, and the Soviets had been denied access to most of what they sought. The program would continue for years, bringing more Germans to the United States as new needs arose and new expertise was identified. But the foundation had been laid, the precedent established. The moral compromises had been made, and they would not be unmade. The men who built the V-2 would go on to build the rockets that took Americans to the moon. The chemists who developed nerve gas would contribute to arsenals that could kill millions. The engineers who designed jets for the Luftwaffe would shape the aircraft that fought in Korea and Vietnam. And Germany would remain divided, occupied, stripped of the minds and machines that might have rebuilt it. The nation that had sought to conquer Europe lay broken and partitioned, its cities ruins, its people scattered and starving, its future mortgaged to the victors who had claimed everything of value and left the rest to burn.